The Adios Pro Evo 1 came with a warning about how short its high-performance lifespan would be. The Adios Pro Evo 2 came with no such warning. So did Adidas just get rid of the warning? Or can this shoe last like a normal racing shoe? Let's talk about the Adios Pro Evo 2 after 100 miles. Yo, what's going on? My name is Kofuzi and I'm a not only runner who reviews running shoes here on YouTube. And today I want to talk to you guys about the Adidas Adios Pro Evo 2 after 100 miles. But before I give you my thoughts on this shoe, I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a pair of shoes that Adidas sent me for the purpose of review, so I did not have to pay for these shoes. However, nobody's paying me to make this video or to include their brand in this video, and no one's going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with the disclosure out of the way, let's talk about the Adios Pro Evo 2. And for these follow-up reviews, I like to start with how I've been using the shoe. Now this is a race shoe, and it's kind of a top tier race shoe, so it's an even racier race shoe. Now I'm getting ready for a marathon myself. It's coming up in just a couple of weeks, and so I've been fortunate to have the Adios Pro Evo 2 in my arsenal as I've been getting ready. And the workouts that I've been reaching for this shoe have been my threshold repeats. I'd like to do a 6 times 6 minutes at threshold effort, and having the Evo 2 for that workout is really nice. I feel like it does help me to stay at my intended efforts and makes those paces seem a little bit nicer on paper, which is always a nice little confidence boost. But I've also been using this shoe for my long runs as well. I've used it both for a long run that had marathon effort miles in it. I used it for a 3 times 5K marathon effort run that ended up being a total of 20 miles. I also took it out just for a steady long run as well. Something that was a little bit faster than easy, but nothing that had any real structure to it, just an 18-mile run. And even at that much slower pace, or a relatively slower pace, I found that the shoe was relatively agreeable. Now, because of the price of the shoe, that's probably not the ideal use case for the shoe. A lot of shoes can kind of do 18 miles steady, but this shoe can handle it as well. So it does have a little bit more range than you might expect for a top tier $500 race shoe. Now, I didn't have a chance to race in it. I tried to race in it as I was getting ready for my Sydney Marathon over the summer, and I tried to race a 5K in it. I mixed up the days, so I ended up that day just taking the shoe out for a 5K threshold effort. And for those longer threshold efforts as well, this shoe is really fun to be able to run in. But it is a difficult shoe to run in. There's a couple of ways that this shoe likes to be run in my experience. And whenever you're not hitting the shoe in those two modes, then I feel like the shoe kind of fights against you or doesn't feel as special. It may even feel like there's a little bit of braking happening with each of the strides. And so for me, when I'm very much on the toes and running with very clean upright form, that's where I feel like I'm getting a really nice sense of bounce from this foam. It's absorbing impact and then really springing back nicely. The other way that I like the shoe is when I'm a little bit more relaxed and I'm landing squarely in that midfoot and doing a little bit more rolling forward. That's where I also feel like the shoe is nice. It's not quite as special as when you're bouncing off of that toe, like landing in the forefoot and then pushing off of that forefoot. But that's another area where I do feel like I'm still pretty efficient nevertheless in the shoe. Any other time where I'm landing a little bit more towards the heel or landing kind of like in the forefoot, midfoot, in this in-between area, that's where I feel like the shoe is not necessarily fighting me. It just doesn't feel $500 special, if that makes sense. The sweet spot on this shoe is really small, and so if you're the kind of runner that likes to run in those sweet spots, this shoe is going to be a lot of fun. If not, the shoe might feel a little bit underwhelming. Now that we've talked about how I've been using the shoe, let's talk about how the shoe has been holding up. The first thing I'll say is this stripe is still holding on for dear life. Now this is a stripe on the shoe that started getting loose, I think maybe after my first run, within the first like 10 miles or so, but it has managed to stay on for 100 miles worth of use. So kudos to this little stripe for managing to stay on. As far as the rest of the upper goes, I feel like it's all holding up really well. The shoe still feels really tight whenever I put it on, just as tight as when I first got it. So this material, this translucent see-through material that is a metaphor for the lightness of the shoe, is not stretching. And so it is retaining its integrity throughout the life of this shoe. It's still kind of finicky to get in and out of this shoe, but these days, all the kind of top tier racing shoes are a little bit difficult to get in and out of. I'm not seeing any fraying of the material all throughout this heel cup either, so everything still feels really great. I am seeing a couple of beads of glue starting to break on the forefoot, not on this shoe, but on the left shoe. I don't think it's really gonna be a problem. That bead of glue kind of looked like there was a little bit too much glue to begin with when I got the shoe, so I'm not sure that it's a big deal, but it is something that I did notice is that part of glue is starting to break at the 100-mile mark. But as far as the upper goes, that's really the only thing that has been a noticeable issue. Now, as far as the outsole goes, this really thin layer of rubber is super glossy and slippery at this point. It's very smooth as you run your hand over it. It's almost like it's been polished at this point, but there's still a lot of it here, and thankfully there are these grooves that they cut into the outsole this year that gives this shoe a little bit of bite and traction. And so when I'm on drive pavement, I've been still absolutely fine. I haven't even noticed how glossy this outsole is. Wet pavement has been fine, but when I'm on like wet painted surfaces or some surfaces that tend to get a little bit more slippery when wet, that's where you are going to feel a little bit less secure in this shoe. As far as like the wear though on the rubber goes, even though it's a super thin layer, I am still seeing that there is a lot of it here. There's no parts where the rubber has completely worn away, which is kind of what I was expecting with all the cutouts that they put into this shoe. Now, I do think that these cutouts are like a little bit bigger than when I first got the shoe, but they're all still here and they're all still doing their job. So as flimsy as the outsole may seem, it's still doing its job. Now, the big story is, what is the midsole feel like at 100 miles? And I feel like there's still a lot of life left in this shoe. When I ran in the Adios Pro Evo 1, that shoe, I felt like after about 70 miles, I didn't really want to put that shoe on anymore. And now that shoe was a lot more aggressive, and it felt to me there was like so much less stack height to that shoe. So it was already a harder shoe for me to run in, or a more difficult shoe, I think is a more clear word to use. It was a more difficult shoe for me to run in to begin with. So when I felt like that foam was starting to compress, I felt like I had reached the end of its useful life at about 70 miles. Could I go run a workout in it? Probably, sure. Would I want to race in it at that point? No, I don't think I would want to, even if it was a shorter race. Now with this shoe, I'm at 100 miles in it, and I still think that I could show up to the starting line of a marathon, and this is a shoe that I do think I could run a marathon in. I think I could show up to the start line of a marathon at 100 miles and still have a really good time running in the shoe. It would still have all those things that are kind of quirky about the shoe, and that the upper is really tight and the sweet spot on the shoe is really small. But as far as the foam goes, I feel like the foam is still behaving as it should. I don't know how much farther the shoe is going to be able to go than that though. Normally I'm looking for about 150 miles of racing and workout usage in a race product. And then after that, maybe like another 100 miles of using it just for workouts. This shoe, I feel like 100 is maybe towards the top end of the racing, maybe 125. So like starting at 100 miles and racing up to 125 or 126. And then maybe there'll be some life left in this shoe afterwards. I wouldn't expect to get as much life out of this shoe as, say, just the regular Adios Pro, but I do think that you're getting a lot more than you would in the original Adios Pro Evo 1. Now, before we wrap up this video, let's take a moment to zoom out and talk about durability, specifically as it relates to racing product. In other words, how long should a racing shoe last? Now, in the pre-super shoe era, in other words, not that long ago, the common way that a lot of people like to think about their racing shoes is that they wanted race flats. They wanted as little shoe as possible, as little cushion, as little weight that they had to carry across the 26.2 miles as possible. And kind of like the ideal dream of a shoe would be a shoe that completely fell apart and disintegrated the moment your foot crossed the finish line. That's how little shoe people wanted. But if the shoe was going to disintegrate as you crossed the finish line, that meant that it was a 26.2 mile shoe, maybe like 27.2, depending on how long your warm-up is. But that was kind of like the prevailing, not wisdom is not the right word, but the prevailing kind of like North Star for designing race product. But then the paradigm in racing shoes changed with the dawn of the super shoe or the carbon plated shoe era. And I'm talking specifically about the Vaporfly 4% and the Vaporfly 4% Flyknit, the original carbon plated race shoes. They're not the original carbon plated race shoes, but as far as like super shoes in this discussion goes, they'll be the original. And they had that Zoom X foam. Remember, it came out of the box crinkly and people were already worried that, hey, is there something wrong with this shoe? Look at all these wrinkles, and people always freaked out about crinkles and wrinkles in their shoe. And those shoes were great. They changed the way that people approach marathons. They changed the sport. Probably one of the most important advances in running in our lifetimes that we'll see. But the big complaint that people had about these shoes, for some reason, is that they didn't last very long. Compared to the bricks that we were running in that had like a 3 or 4 millimeters of rubber on the outsole, plastic Trustic systems to keep our foot locked into place. Those were the shoes, those were the tanks that were lasting people 400, 500, 600 miles, 1,000 miles. And for some reason, even though the prevailing North Star had been to make the lightest possible race flats possible that would disintegrate upon crossing the finish line, when it came to the Zoom X shoes, we somehow demanded that they last longer than they were lasting. And that's kind of where I originally started seeing that these race shoes were lasting about 100 miles at kind of peak performance and then starting to drop off. Still good enough for some workouts, but maybe not something that you'd want to race in. And so hearing that complaint from an otherwise excellent product, I think that what happened is they started playing around with the foams. And I think part of it was that the foams were expensive to make. There was a high rate of failure in terms of making these midsole foams. And so they wanted a way to make it a little bit more profitable so there'd be less waste. And that also ended up increasing the durability and longevity. And so we got two shoes that I think are notable. We got the Vaporfly Next% 2 and the Alphafly 2. I think these are two of the least successful in the super shoe category from Nike. And I think the unifying thing between each of these two is that the ZoomX formulations in each of these two felt a little bit different compared to what we had known. And that, granted, at least with the Alphafly, there was a significant change in the geometry from Alphafly 1 to Alphafly 2, which could have explained a lot. But there wasn't a lot of change in the geometry in Vaporfly Next% 1 and Vaporfly Next% 2. And so the change was really due to the foam. And I feel like the foams got more durable, but they also got less special. They were a lot less exciting to me. And I feel like this is why we can't have nice things, is because we had these great products and we complained about a parameter that we normally don't care about when it comes to racing. That's longevity. And so we got a compromised product in these shoes. And I feel like that's kind of like what we had going on here with the Evo 1. Now this shoe came out extremely light, one of the lightest shoes to ever hit the market, using a non-compression molded aliphatic TPU that was super airy, but not lasting very long. I think 50 miles was the estimated lifespan for this shoe. So basically you could buy the shoe, do a long run workout in it to make sure it's not going to bother you in any sort of unpredictable way. Then you could do your warm up and race in the shoe and it would disintegrate across the finish line. Mine lasted about 70 miles before I stopped really wanting to run in it. And so we had this shoe that was great, very aggressive, not for everyone, but a $500 shoe, so obviously not for everyone. And we also had, on the other hand, the Adios Pro 3 and now the Adios Pro 4. And so for people that didn't want to go with the uncompromising nature of the Evo 1, pinnacle performance, I don't care how long it lasts, I also don't care how much it costs, you have a regular race shoe that's still a super shoe, carbon fiber, premium foams, lightweight shoe, a shoe for running fast and racing hard that has more of a normal lifespan. That was an option for you. But yet, nevertheless, people still complained about this one, even though the shoe was always sold out and flying off the shelves. And so I think that's how we got to the Evo 2, where it's now lasting a little bit longer, but to me, it's a little bit less special. We've taken a little bit edge off. The delta between these two shoes, I think, has shrank quite a bit. So I think at a time where not only do brands have more than one racing shoe that is available to cater to different kinds of runner, kind of like the Vaporfly Alphafly or Metaspeed Edge, Metaspeed Sky kind of distinction. We also have brands with multiple tiers of product, one for regular racers and one for like elites or people that are really spending a lot of time and energy and money trying to make one more big swing at a big result, that are willing to not make any compromises and pay for the privilege of not having any compromises in their race product. So there's two different tiers that are available. So it's not like I'm demanding that everyone race in shoes that only last 50 miles. There's still, that shoe is still here. But I'm saying that when it comes to that pinnacle uncompromising product, I think we shouldn't be making compromises. And so how long a shoe should last depends really on what tier of race product we're in. If we're in kind of everyday tier, which is kind of weird to say everyday and super shoe, but if we're talking about like regular super shoes, I think they should last about 125 to 150 miles of racing and then another 100 miles of workouts after that. When it comes to this upper tier of uncompromising race product, I feel like 50 is plenty. We don't have to worry about much more than that. And I think that any compromise that we're making in performance to get a little bit more than 50, I think is a misplaced priority. Now let's wrap up this video by going over an updated buying guide, and we'll also go over some updated alternative options. The Adios Pro Evo 2 is a toned down version from what you were getting in last year's Evo 1, but it's still one of the most aggressive shoes available on the market today. And at $500, it's still not really a shoe that I'm going to be able to recommend to most people. But if this is something that you're interested in, even at that $500 price, at least you're getting a more normal-ish durability and lifespan out of the shoe. Now, let's take a look at some of the alternatives to see what else is at the tip of the spear in terms of pinnacle product. Now, in the first review video that I made for the Evo 2, I gave you the options of the On Cloud Boom Light Spray and the Puma Fast R3. And I still think that those two are very good alternatives to consider, but I also have one new option for you to think about that didn't exist on the market yet at the time I initially reviewed the Evo 2. And then I'll talk about one other shoe that I think has gone largely overlooked this year, but the more and more I think about the Evo 2, the more I'm reminded of this other one. First, let's start with the newbie to the market, and that is from ASICS. This is the Metaspeed Ray. Now, ASICS is one of those brands that has multiple tiers now of race product. They have their Metaspeed Edge Tokyo and their Metaspeed Sky Tokyo, and in their kind of super elite shoe, they have the Metaspeed Ray, just like how Adidas has the Adios Pro, and then they also have the Evo 2. Now, this is another shoe that is incredibly lightweight, using a brand new type of foam that's going to be very aggressive for a lot of people in terms of how squishy this shoe is. In terms of deciding between these two shoes, whether you want a racing shoe that is on the very squishy side or on the very responsive side, I think that's going to be the way that you're going to pick. I tend to love stuff that's really squishy and dynamic. And for race product, that means it squishes like crazy when your foot lands on the ground and then also springs back really explosively as you're pushing off. I feel like it needs to have both of those to be a very exciting shoe. I think that the ASICS Metaspeed Ray delivers that, and I enjoy that much more than the very pingy, dense, responsive nature of the Evo 2. And so I'm preferring that shoe, and I'm also preferring the price of that one as it comes in at $300. And then the other shoe that I think we need to talk about is a shoe that's been overlooked by a lot of people. I think because it's a very difficult shoe to run in. It's also a difficult shoe name to pronounce, but it's the shoe from Craft. But the thing that made me think about this shoe as I was testing the Evo 2 more and more is that small sweet spot of this shoe. You have to be really bouncing off the front of the shoe to get the most out of the responsiveness. And I felt the same way about this Craft carbon plated eraser. It's a lighter shoe, especially for a Craft shoe, which generally tend to be kind of on the heavy side, but it's not ultra lightweight like the Metaspeed Ray or like the Evo 2 is, but it is a lighter shoe, and it does get a really nice pingy sensation if you land on it just right. But it's also a very difficult shoe to run in. It has a very small sweet spot, and I find it's kind of tough to run on this double-walled canyon of foam through the back here. It has a lot of similar notes as the Adios Pro Evo 2. And I think if you wanted, say, like a toned down and a slightly less expensive version of the Evo 2, I think this Craft option is one taking a look at. It is still really expensive though, and I think more expensive than it should be, but at least it's not $500 as this one comes in at $320. So those are my thoughts on the Adios Pro Evo 2. I feel like we are our own worst enemies when it comes to seeing what the absolute best in technology can be. I hope that in the future that Adidas continues to push the envelope, even if it makes a couple people grumpy about how short-lived that shoe might be. If you have any other comments or questions about the Adios Pro Evo 2 or any of the shoes that I talked about today, feel free to put them in the comments down below, or better yet, stop a live stream that I do Mondays and Thursdays over on the Kofuzi Run Club channel. I'd love to see you guys over there in the chat. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of this video. I hope you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I will see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?